Hello all viewers, welcome to Chapter 4, The Vanguard. In this chapter, we explore the trailblazers, the fearless leaders who push boundaries, spark change, and shape the future. Get ready to meet the minds that lead from the front. Before the clash of giants in 1962, shadows moved silently through the dense jungles of the northeast. They were not the army. They were not the police. They were something else entirely. The Assam Rifles, the forgotten vanguard of India's border defense. This is their untold story of grit, sacrifice, and silent heroism in the face of looming war, fighting an invisible enemy long before the world took notice. They held the line when no one else could, and no one else would. When India stumbled in the face of the Chinese onslaught, fingers pointed fast and furious, Nehru's forward policy, army unpreparedness. But almost no one asked, who's already there? Who had been holding the line long before the first army boots hit the hills? The Assam Rifles had already carved their way into the frontier. Quietly, relentlessly. Assam was already a cauldron of conflict in the late 1700s. Rebels surged, kings fell, and into this chaos marched the British, armed, organized, and opportunistic. A clash of steel and stick. Muskets versus bamboo. The future of an entire region turned, with 550 men. The Ahom dynasty, once mighty, collapsed not with a roar, but a suffocating whimper under Burmese boots. 7 years of terror followed. A nightmare remembered in Assamese as Manner Din, the days of darkness. And when the people turned again for help, the British didn't just come. They stayed. Out of rebellion and raids, the need for a new kind of force emerged. Not army, not police. A force that lived the land it protected. Born in 1835, under a civilian named Grange, the Cachar Levy, first bloodline of what would become the Assam Rifles. They pushed into lands the empire called unadministered, through fog-choked passes, against warriors of the hills, Nagas, Kukis, Mizos. These weren't just raids. They were frontier wars fought in silence, led by the quiet men of the levy. With Assam now under British control, plantations sprouted across its fertile valleys. Tea flowed, profit soared, but so did tensions. The thirst for land grew fierce, and so did resistance. Assam's hills brewed not just tea, but tension with tribal raids and territorial chaos on the rise. What began as commerce was turning into conflict, and the fires were just being lit. The British Empire faced a dilemma. The army was too expensive, the police too soft. What they needed was something in between, disciplined, agile, and ruthless when required. The British found their middle path, a leaner force with sharper teeth, what would become the Assam Rifles. Born in 1835 as the Cachar Levy, this was no ordinary unit. It was a new breed of frontier sentinels. Men hardened by terrain, trained to track, strike, and survive where others fell. They didn't march in columns, they moved like shadows through hostile hills. Neither fully soldiers nor mere lawmen. They were both sword and shield. And in the silence of the frontier, their legend began to whisper through the trees. By 1878, the British mindset shifted. Defense was no longer enough. The empire wanted more control, more territory, more submission. And so, the Assam Rifles were unleashed, no longer just sentinels, but stormbringers. From guarding borders to expanding them, the Assam Rifles took the fight to the frontiers. Punitive expeditions thundered into tribal lands, carrying with them the weight of empire. Villages burned, resistance broke, and the hills echoed with boots and gunfire. What began as a shield had now become a spear, sharp, swift, and unstoppable. In the wild, unmapped corners of the northeast, a new kind of war had begun, and leading it were men whose names history would nearly forget, but whose legacy still echoes in every patrol today. When the world was at war, the call to serve echoed through the hills of the northeast. The Assam Rifles answered, not just as guardians of borders, but as warriors of global battlefields. From the trenches of World War I to the dense jungles of Burma in World War II, they fought, they fell, they rose again. They weren't just border guards, they were war heroes, operating in silence and in shadows. As part of the legendary Victor Force, they moved behind enemy lines, guiding, spying, striking. No medals awaited them, no headlines praised them, but history remembers. Because in the darkest hours, it was these silent soldiers who lit the path to victory. Their courage didn't wear rank, it wore resolve. In 1947, as a new nation found its footing, its frontiers stood vulnerable and forgotten. The Northeast was distant, politically, geographically, and dangerously exposed. While Nehru's advisors debated maps in Delhi, others were already defending them. When the Indian Army was yet to step in, the Assam Rifles were already standing guard at the edge of the nation. No parades, no fanfare, just grit, patrol boots, and unwavering duty in hostile terrain. They weren't waiting for orders. They were writing the first lines of India's frontier defense. Alone in the wild, they became the first and last line, before the storm would come. The Northeast wasn't just a frontier. It was a maze of mountains, mist, and mistrust. From NEFA to Bhutan and Sikkim, the land rose like a wall, guarded by fiercely independent tribes. To the British, every step forward was met with silence or resistance. Geography shaped strategy, and the tribes shaped the tone of every frontier encounter. This was not just about borders, but about survival in a land where allegiance had to be earned, not imposed. And those who dared enter had to learn the language of the land or be swallowed by it. At the dawn of the 20th century, the far reaches of northeast India remained an enigma to the British Empire. Shrouded in mist, guarded by dense forests, towering mountains, and fiercely independent tribes, this was a frontier not just of land, but of the unknown. A place where maps faded and empires hesitated. In the remote Siang Valley, the empire met its match. Columns of British troops, trained for open battlefields, were swallowed by jungle and ambushed by the unseen. The Abor tribes didn't fight in lines, they struck from shadows, vanished into the mist, and bled the invaders dry. It wasn't just a defeat, it was humiliation. And as the bodies were counted, so were the questions. In 1912, the empire changed its strategy. No battalions, no fanfare, just a handful of men with maps, grit, and nerves of steel. Captains George Bailey and S.F. Mozed led small, silent survey parties into the unmapped Mishmi and Abor hills, where no soldier had returned unscathed. They weren't there to conquer. They were there to listen, to learn, and to disappear into the wild. This was a new kind of mission, one that would redraw maps and rewrite the very rules of engagement on the frontier. From the mistless village of Mipi, they marched into silence, where no empire had tread, and no map dared speak. With Mishmi porters at their side, and the unknown ahead, they climbed through snow-choked passes, their breath thin, their resolve thicker. Yungagyapla, Pangpungla, ancient gateways carved in ice and stone. Beyond them lay Tibet, and the great secret the world had only imagined, the legendary bend of the Brahmaputra, roaring through the roof of the world. In the shadowed valleys of Pyomi, welcome was cautious, and suspicion ran deep. To the Tibetan officials, these foreigners were more than travelers, perhaps spies in surveyor's clothing. But Morshead didn't hide. He laid his instruments bare, turning distrust into curiosity. Armed not with rifles, but with rare Tibetan passports, they moved deeper into the heart of the forbidden land. As the air thinned and the sky drew closer, the world flattened into a vast, wine-scarred silence. Here, barley grew stunted, breath came shallow, and winter never truly left. This was the Tibetan plateau, remote, regal, and utterly unforgiving. From the barren vines of the Tibetan plateau, they descended into a world reborn. The Subansiri and calming basins unfolded like a green abyss, dense, dripping, and utterly unmapped. Here, the mountains breathed mist, the rivers spoke in roars, and every step was a wager against the unknown. This was no longer a survey. It was an exploration into the lungs of the eastern Himalayas. The final leg wound through the stone-built villages of the Monpas, where smoke curled from chimneys and fields burned bright with madge and chilies. After 6 grueling months across ice, altitude, and unknown lands, they were coming home. Worn but unbroken, they carried more than maps. They brought back stories etched in sweat, silence, and survival. The frontier had been crossed and recorded. From footsteps in the mountains came ink on a map. Guided by the surveys of Bailey and Morshead, the British and Tibetans carved a bold new frontier on paper. At Simla in 1914, the McMahon Line was drawn, clean, final, and fateful. But one voice was missing. China never signed. A boundary was born, along with a dispute that would echo for generations. It was a line scribbled across parchment in a quiet room in Simla. Thousands of miles away from the wine-bitten cliffs and river gorges it was meant to divide. The McMahon Line, crafted from maps, memory, and imperial ambition, was never signed by China. Yet, it became the de facto boundary, an invisible thread stretched taut across unforgiving terrain. For years, it lay silent, empty, uninhabited. But silence can be deceptive. In the narrow valley of Namka Chu, where even echoes hesitate, that thread would snap. Steel met snow, boots met mud, and diplomacy gave way to gunfire. The war of 1962 didn't start in Delhi or Beijing. It began here, in a place born from ink and claimed in blood. The McMahon Line was never just a boundary. It was a time bomb buried in the Himalayas. And its legacy? Still smoldering, still unresolved, still waiting. In the jungles of NEFA and the heights of Tibet, Morshead and Bailey didn't just map land, they mapped destiny. With every step, they redrew borders, shifted futures, and stirred tensions that still burn today. Because on this frontier, the past isn't over, and the line is never truly settled. This was just one chapter in a story that still shapes our borders and our future. If you're finding this journey as fascinating as we do, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. There's much more to uncover, and it's only just begun.